Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and this is day 2 of week 2, and our class is moving along rather rapidly. So we want to be sure that we stay up with the work that is before us. I do encourage you to work a little bit every day and try not to wait until Sunday evening to get everything in, because you can't do your best work, and you definitely won't have the time to do the readings and things that you need to do to grasp the concepts in this course, to listen to the lectures. I think sometimes we're more interested in getting the piece of paper than we are to get the information for the degree. And that will not put you in good stead when you get into your career spot and begin to work on your career, because you do need the knowledge in order to operate as a professional. So as we move forward from yesterday, we talked about a great deal about reality. What does reality involve? And that's a concept that may be a little bit difficult for us to wrap our heads around, because we just kind of live our lives without thinking. As I told you at the beginning, Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that's what we're doing. We're examining our lives to see why we do what we do, and understand the way that we understand. We have the ability to think about thinking, honestly. We're probably the only species on the planet that can say that. One of the other parameters that we really need to talk about today is the idea of truth, and what is truth, and whether there is absolute truth or not. Truth is a major factor in the world that we live in. It's how we operate based upon truth statements and how they interact with our being. You have, if you're in religion, you realize that there is a certain amount of truth claimed there in the Bible, that the Bible is true. The particular group that I came from as I grew up believed that the Bible was perfect and without error, and that it was the very voice of God, and that when it spoke, it was the rule of faith and practice for how we ought to live. That's changed greatly today. There are many other opinions about that. The Bible's a good book. The Bible, it's a great book of morals to follow, whatever it is. Even Thomas Jefferson took his Bible and took a knife and cut out all the things that had to do with miracles that he didn't believe in, or he didn't believe that walking on the water, turning water into wine, any of those events in the New Testament ascribed to Jesus. He simply believed Jesus was a great moral leader. And so he created the Jefferson Bible, which you can still buy, by the way, at the Smithsonian, that has things about Jesus, the philosopher, and Jesus, the teacher, and all those things are things that Jefferson believed that went into the religion of Christianity. So, and then we have Truth in Politics, which has really taken a beating in the last 4 or 5 years. And with our media, there was a time that we expected our media to foster truth and to tell truth and to be unbiased in their reporting. And we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years that to be exactly the opposite. So there's a great question today in the world about what can we rely on, or what can we believe. I often tell my students in the history classes that whenever you pick up a book, the first thing you should ask yourself is, what is this person trying to sell me? He has a particular point of view. He has a bias. He has a bill of goods that he is trying to get us to understand. For instance, if it's a book on the Civil War, the first thing that would help you is to know whether he was pro-Confederate or pro-Union, because he's going to write from that particular perspective, and you're going to get one view. If you want to balance his view, then you will find an author that writes from the other side and read his, and then compare the two together. You would have a closer understanding of truth than you would have had with just reading one side or the other. We have talked a little bit about epistemology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge and how it develops, and that is the focus of this chapter, is how truth develops, how we come to understand or place our confidence in things as being truth. There are some beliefs that would seem to be what they call self-evident. It's obvious, and others that are not obvious. So we're looking at 2 different kinds of things here, things that we can see with our eyes, that we understand, that would be obvious truth. And then there are other things that maybe are a little more, things that are greater. We talk a lot about common sense. For example, going out in damp weather can cause us to lower our resistance and get sick. That would be my grandmother talking there. But doctors really actually dispute that fact based upon scientific evidence. And yet we hold on to those things because grandmother said them, grandmother believed them, and we don't often accept the doctor's prognosis for that. There are, statements that are, crystal clear that we have no debate about. There are others that, we don't know about. The one about, there's gravity between two masses. We can't actually see that happen, or we can experiment on some things, and there are universal statements that we claim. But in order to prove a universal statement, you would have to be everywhere at the same time, to verify that. So the statement like, there are no dinosaurs left in the world. Well, we assume that to be true, but in order to verify that actually, we would have to be everywhere at the same time, and sure enough, not see a dinosaur, as to understand that statement to be true. So basically, we want to kind of start today with two kinds of truth as we introduce this chapter. One, the truth because of the facts, and two, the truth because of reasoning. Now, you think about the first of those two, they are called empirical truth, that we have facts to back it up, that is truth because of the experience. In science, we use what's called the scientific method. There are 7 steps that scientists follow every time in their experiments. And when something happens or something occurs, you ought to be able to go through that same series of steps and come out with the same finding every time, or the same conclusion. Those are empirical truths. Every time you add 1 + 1, you get 2. Every time you multiply 2 times 3, you get 6. You don't get 7 sometimes, and 5 sometimes, and 3 sometimes. That is an empirical truth that we count on. We count on the fact that a foot, the measurement foot is 12 inches, that 3 feet equal a yard, that 5,280 feet equal a mile. Those things do not change. Some of them may be arbitrarily set, but they don't change. Those are empirical truths that you can count on, that you can take to the bank every time, and they will always work. Philosophers refer to a lot of statements that as contingent or contingent truth, but usually truth doesn't change from time to time. So empirical or factual truths are things that we think about in this. Then there is what we call necessary truth, a statement that is true because of reasoning. On the other hand, is necessarily true, or it is a necessary truth. Necessary is here the opposite of contingent. We always imagine that what it would be for a contingent truth not to be true, or a contingent falsehood not to be false. We can't even make sense out of the suggestion that a necessary truth might not be true. The statement 2 + 2 = 4 is a necessary truth, in that we cannot imagine a world where that would be false. So basically, those are the two kinds of truth. When you believe, for instance, in the existence of God, for example, it would seem to be the belief in a fact. And yet, many philosophers have argued by means of contradictions that the existence of God may not be an ultimate fact. When I teach history, one of the best examples of that would be the first 5 books of Genesis, which contains the creation story, which contains the story of the Noahic flood and the first beginnings of all people. Those things were passed down in the Hebrew world, the Jewish world, by word of mouth or by oral history. You have the same things true with Native American history. Their stories are passed down by oral history because there was no writing for centuries. The Sumerians were the first in the Near East to write down their language. The Cherokee Indians were the first to write their language in the 1800s. What happened to all of those stories and all those facts? Well, you can surmise that there might be some errors in them. If you've ever played the game as a kid in the room where you whisper something in someone's ear and they are supposed to be transmitting it around the room. And when that statement or question or whatever gets back to you, it is a completely different statement. So in oral history, there are no guidelines or no foundations upon which we can test the hypothesis. In the case of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they contain a great deal of history. But we say to students, we don't accept them as history because there was no observer there for most of it. Nobody was with God on the mornings of creation and saw him create the world. But we lay down that, we write that in the Bible. It's included in the Bible along with other things. So that doesn't mean it's necessarily false. It means that we can't take it in the same vein as we take history. We take it by faith. So as a Christian, they would say, well, I believe in Adam and Eve and the creation story by faith. I can't say that it is historical because there are parameters about what is historical and how important, and we don't have those there. We don't have eyewitness accounts. This chapter talks about rationality in relation to truth. There are things that are rational and there are things that are irrational. And the irrational things, irrational people tend to latch on to irrational truth and try to promote it as the truth. We have seen that in the last election. People that after, no matter how much checking you do of an election, how much verifying you do, there are people that will hold on to the irrational truth that somehow, some way, the election was rigged and that the wrong persons won. Now, you have on one side people that are doing everything they can to verify and to certify that election because it is there. You have on the other side the irrational folks that it doesn't matter what you tell them or what they see in print, or you could count the votes 1,000 times and they're going to hold on to this irrational truth that somehow the election was rigged. And it's very difficult to deal with people when they are irrational and when they won't accept truth or facts or empirical data to prove their point. And so, you know, it's an ongoing problem that is really shaking the very foundations of our democratic republic. And, you know, who knows what's going to come out of that. Knowledge or truth is important. There are a lot of presuppositions that we hold in our thinking about that, in which we could believe nothing, know nothing, or think nothing if we're, you know, or we think something or believe something. So the philosophical principles that lie at the foundation of virtually all of our knowledge and beliefs. These are presuppositions. So when you start thinking about your own philosophical foundation, if you believe in religion, you believe in God, God is a presupposition. We would believe that God is eternal, that God created the earth, that he cannot be destroyed. A scientist by the same concept would believe that atoms are presuppositional, that all things are composed of atoms, and that from atoms everything else is created. So everything around us, the reality that is around us, then is made up of the tiniest particles of atoms. Those with a Christian worldview would say that God created the world, everything around us is created by God, so therefore we have our faith in him as God, a creator. Scientists would say we have our faith in science. And we have our faith in atomic theory and all those things. So you understand those are really presuppositions that are very important. You know, in times of uncertainty, those that are of the religious bent would wonder whether there is a God or whether life has meaning. Those are what we would call an existential crisis. I was reading this week about Elon Musk, the great inventor of the electric car, the SpaceX founder. He owns PayPal, owns all kinds of things. He's a very smart individual. And he was talking about that at 11 and 12 years old, that he had an existential crisis, trying to figure out what makes the world tick. Why are we here? Where are we going? Is there a purpose, or are we just animals on a planet, cohabitating, reproducing, eating, sleeping, and dying? Or is there some real purpose? That is the very foundation of what we're talking about in these chapters. Those questions all of us have. And so that was one of the great controversies in the 1800s when Charles Darwin in 1859 published his On Origin of Species. And then in 1870 published The Descent of Man, in which he said that men evolved from lower orders, that we came from a one cell amoeba maybe, and that we have multiplied into what we are today. And that happened by random chance. And so that we're here by chance. We're just another organism on the planet that is doing just that. We eat, we sleep, we reproduce, we die. Is there no purpose to that? And he could not deal. The interesting thing is that the evolution people cannot deal with ultimate meaning in life. They can deal with the science, the regeneration, how we came to be here, but they offer no response on what does it mean to be living? What does it mean to be? And so religion kind of tries to fill that gap to convince us that, hey, we're somebody, we're not just some one cell from the primordial ooze that somehow got out of the mud and became a tadpole and became a human. And that's a very simplistic thing to say, but that's kind of in a nutshell what we look at. So the odds of us becoming the organism that we are is rather tremendous. Even Darwin said, and Darwin, believe it or not, was a trained clergyman. He was a minister. But Darwin says the one great exception, I think I mentioned this to you at the beginning, the one great exception to his idea of evolution was the human eye. That the idea that the eye could become what it is and what it does for the body just by mere chance would be absolutely astronomical and impossible. We have lots of skeptics in the world, people that are skeptical. Maybe you're skeptical. Maybe you believe that that nothing exists. As one philosopher said, nothing exists. If anything did exist, we wouldn't know it. If we would know it, we couldn't communicate with it. So that's kind of a very pessimistic view about existence. And some people do have that view. You know, we're just fodder for the, you know, whatever goes on in the world. We're waiting for the cemetery. We're dying every moment that we're living. Skepticism has been an important part of the idea of philosophy from the beginning, arguing that maybe there is not a doubt. But doubt's a very much a part of who we are. If you never doubt who you are, you would never inspect your life to see what needs to be changed or how you could change it. And we go back to that statement again, the unexamined life is not worth living. If you're not willing to look at yourself and look at your life and ask the hard questions, then maybe you're not really living. You know, what is really living to you? As you think about that, we can all be skeptical, we can all be negative, but the reality is, when the day is done, are you really living? Are you really enjoying the life that you're given? And so basically, a lot of philosophers, you're going to read about many from David Hume to Immanuel Kant, who deal with this idea of skepticism, and we have it today very much so. We have people that are skeptical of science. They don't believe the vaccines are doing what scientists claim that they're doing, and that is well within their purview. They have every right to do that as long as they don't impede other people. That's it's the thing about freedom. We'll talk about freedom, but the thing is, your freedom stops where somebody else's nose begins. You can't have absolute ultimate freedom for everybody without some kind of restraints that keep law and order, because when the day is done, we are reminded that we're kind of animals that will kill each other. Humans are very dangerous animals. It's kind of like having a chimpanzee for a pet. They talk about people that train them end up usually getting killed by this pet that they have fed and pampered and clothed and all this stuff all these years, and one day it'll tear your face off. Humans are very much like that, and chimpanzees are genetically our closest cousin, but you have to be very careful around wild animals. You don't bring a tiger to live in your house. You don't bring jackals. You don't bring a panther. You don't bring a snake without understanding that that snake can be deadly, and you don't know what it's thinking. And you can have a boa for 20 years, and one day it just turns on you and squeezes the life out of you. So basically, we think of ourselves in those kinds of terms. Lastly, I want to talk to you about the nature of truth. Not all truth is the same. There are some truths that are more important, more vital than others. There is a theory of what truth is and does. And so we want to just kind of think about that as you read through these materials. There are basic ways of reaching truthful, understanding of things. And of course, the more you read, the more you study, the more you think, the more you come to terms with things, and they become a part of your being and make you the balanced person that you are. One of the great benefits of education is for you to be able to learn lots of things and see how other people dealt with their lives and the problems of life, and they ended up becoming, a very well-rounded person who was able to do so much more. You have to have order in the chaos, and that involves in your thinking as well. And there has to be some foundational truths in your life, non-negotiables, that you don't give into. In my ethics class, they develop a personal ethics. Some of them are nurses, some of them are vet techs, but they write down what are the non-negotiables, what are the things that you hold to very dearly that you don't violate. And I think everyone has, there is a point of which we don't go beyond as human beings. There are things that we hold to very tightly. Those kind of things will change as you get older. I have often said that mine have changed greatly. I was a pastor for 20 years, and one day I decided when I left my last church that I was not going to remain the same that I had been. I'd always been in a Baptist church, in a all-white church, in a church where women were not allowed to hold leadership positions. Those churches were anti-gay, and I thought, that doesn't reflect what I believe about what the Bible says. And so for the rest of my life, I may never pastor again, and I haven't. But if I'm going to be a member of a church, the church I'm a member of now does allow women ministers and women deacons, and it is a racially mixed, multi-ethnic church, which I think is what if there is a heaven and there's people there that it's going to look like. And I'm in a church that would try to help and encourage gay people and not put them down and wage war against them. Those convictions changed when I was, older. And so it's important that we understand that truth is like that. Some truths in your own life can change. You may have been raised very, very strict, mom and dad, and you believe that's the only way to raise your children. And then suddenly you get grandchildren, and the whole thing changes. You treat your grandchildren very differently than you did your children. And they're wonderful. My mother always said if she knew how wonderful grandchildren were, she wouldn't have had children. She just waited and had the grandkids. Well, we know that that's tongue in cheek and impossible, but it really reflects how most grandparents are. So truth has a lot to do with rationality and with our thinking. And we live in a very relative world. We don't live in a world of black and whites. We live in a world where most things are gray. And trying to live in a black and white world is very difficult. I know that from having come from religious backgrounds where people are very strict in their ideas. But we don't live in that world. For instance, the first church that I pastored was my home church. And the old standard about divorce was that if you were divorced, you could not hold an office in the church. You couldn't even lead in prayer in the church. And when I took the church, I felt differently about that. I had a precious couple, older couple. She had been married before, had a previous husband, and they wouldn't even let the man lead in prayer or take the offering. And if he was ever brought up as an usher, we had an old deacon that sat on the front seat and said, "Oh, we know why he can't serve." Well, one morning I went to him and I said, "Brother, if I called on you to pray, would you pray?" And he said, "Sure." And I can still hear the gnashing of teeth when I did that morning. But before I left the church, he was an usher taking the offering. He got to be used. And will grow. So basically, truth can change. Truth is not, there are some absolutes. I mean, we would go back and say, well, the 10 Commandments are foundational. They're absolute. We don't murder, cheat, steal. We don't bear false witness. We don't steal our neighbor's wife or his goat or his corn. Those are absolutes that we have to have for our society to survive. So what does that say then? If we're going to take the 10 Commandments down off of our courthouse, we're taking away the absolutes, that there's nothing absolute. We live in a day, it's called, postmodernism, where we have abandoned anything absolute and real for that which is not absolute. It's changing. Our ethics are situational. Our truth is situational. There's nothing that's absolutely always true now. It depends on the situation, depends on your background, you can get arrested for murder today and get off because your environment made you do it. You were poor, more things have been dumped on being poor than anything I could think of, but being poor is not a crime. And there have been a lot of people that rose from poverty to be the great people of the world. It all goes back to us individually, how we're trained, how we're taught, what we're taught about truth, and how we live out our truth. Every one of us have our truth that we live out. You hear that among young people quite often. They hate a hypocrite. They will tell you that person does not walk the talk, but they do want people that do walk the talk. And so when you examine this chapter, we think about truth. I hope that something will come to your mind as you read these pages that we've talked about, that you will find to be helpful and encouraging. I will see you tomorrow, and take care.